Before light had fully touched the world, before mountains rose and rivers flowed, there was only the music of the Ainur, a harmony woven by the thoughts and wills of beings beyond time. In that unmeasured void melodies coalesced, some pure, resonant with the design of Eru Ilúvatar, and others discordant, shadows attempting to shape what could not yet be shaped. It is within such tension, subtle yet inexorable, that the first sparks of imbalance stirred, a trembling note, a shadowed refrain, pregnant with possibility and peril. These early undulations of discord would carry consequence far deeper than the minds of the Ainur could immediately perceive, rippling outward into the forming realm, shaping not only the land and skies but the very essence of beings yet unborn. It was in this crucible that the seeds of the Balrogs first took form, not as creatures of mere malice, but as living echoes of dissonance, embodiments of intent and rebellion given shape. Melkor, the mightiest of the Ainur, felt the resonance of his own ambition ripple across the void. His desire to bend the music, to imprint his will more dominantly upon Arda, produced vibrations that the others could not entirely constrain. Where the harmonies sought balance, he introduced tension, a persistent undertone that flickered like fire along the edges of the emerging world. The first murmurs of flame, of shadow intertwined with light, manifested in this unseen theater, forming shapes that would later take names and purposes, a legate of power, a sentinel of defiance, a vessel of both fear and fascination. Even as the other Ainur observed with cautious inquiry, these manifestations were subtle, nearly imperceptible, a gentle hint rather than a revelation, yet they bore within them the unmistakable signature of Melkor's intent. The forming lands responded in kind. Where mountains began their rise and valleys fell into nascent rivers, the influence of these nascent beings left marks, blackened stone, fissures echoing the void, the first scent of smoke that was not yet fire. It was as if the terrain itself recognized the presence of entities that would one day walk with both majesty and terror. The music itself seemed to warp around them, shaping rhythm into irregular pulses, tension into anticipation. Even at this earliest stage, a principle emerged where intent is focused and unbridled, creation and destruction intertwine, inseparable yet distinct, as if bound by some cosmic covenant that only time would fully reveal. The seed of the Balrogs, though imperceptible to most, carried an inherent duality. They were not yet fully beings of fire, nor were they entirely will alone. They existed in the liminal space where thought, intent, and substance converged. From their potential arose both power and peril. The cost of their creation, though distant and unseen, was already imprinted upon the cosmos. Every note of discord left a trace upon the harmony of Arda, a quiet erosion that would later manifest in shadowed valleys and scorched landscapes, in the tremors that heralded the coming of great events. The music warned that any force born of rebellion carries its own burden, that even the mightiest wills, when untempered, exact payment not only from themselves but from all that they touch. As the realms slowly coalesced, the air itself seemed to vibrate with latent energy, a heat without fire, a presence without form. These were the first whispers of the Balrogs, their essence threading through the void like smoke through the morning air before dawn. One might imagine them as formless shadows of intent, yet already they bore the unmistakable weight of destiny. Each subtle stir of the void, each tremor in the harmonies, hinted at the profound influence they would later exert. The world, though still young, was already imprinted with their signature, a quiet prelude that would echo in ages to come. And so the stage was set, not with clamor or spectacle, but with patient, deliberate unfolding. The first flames flickered in the darkness, not as destruction, but as promise, a covenant of consequence, an introduction of imbalance into the nascent order. The beings that would one day be called Balrogs were not yet fully defined, but their presence was undeniable, a quiet note of tension threaded into the fabric of the forming world. Before the First Age could begin, before the children of Ilúvatar drew breath, before the lands were measured and rivers charted, the seeds of fire and shadow were sown, waiting, unseen yet inevitable, ready to awaken when the music of the world carried them forward into destiny. The void that once murmured with potential now rippled with deeper intention. From the dissonance that Melkor had threaded through the great music came not only echoes, but forms, shapes stirred beneath the surface of becoming, first faint, then sharper, defined not by what they were, but by what they carried. And what they carried was fire, not the warmth of the sun, but a deeper, hungrier flame, born from the friction of defiance and shaped by longing for dominion. These were the Maiar, who, drawn to Melkor's vision, veered from the harmony of Ilúvatar and became his shadows, and among them some burned brighter, fiercer, and darker than the rest. The Balrogs, though not yet known by that name, were not conjured, nor made in the manner of lesser creatures. They were seduced, beings of fire and will, once radiant in purpose, turned inward, smouldering under the weight of a mandate not their own. They were drawn by Melkor's gravity, a call woven through ambition and despair. Where others resisted or fled, they listened, and listening fell. Their transformation was not sudden but inevitable, the quiet culmination of choice and proximity. Fire listens to wind, and they listened to him. In the still-forming landscapes of Arda, they appeared first as silhouettes etched in heat. They walked unannounced along stone ridges newly thrust from the earth, and wherever they lingered, silence came quickly. These were not wild beasts nor mindless monsters, but fallen heralds, each one carrying within them a portion of Melkor's terrible brilliance. Their flame did not consume randomly. It chose. Their whips of fire did not lash wildly. They coiled with thought. Even in the beginning they were lords in their own right, willful, terrible, and obedient only to the one they called master. Among the Valar and the faithful Maiar, whispers began. They spoke of beings cloaked in shadow and crowned in flame, of voices like smoke that bent the will of lesser creatures. The Valar, in their wisdom, did not yet speak their names aloud. Naming gives shape, and in this age, to name something was to permit its permanence. But Melkor knew their names. He spoke them often folded into language only he and his lieutenants understood, carving those names into stone and fire alike. Gothmog, Lungothin, others, still unnamed in history yet no less real in ruin. They became his hands, his fire-wielding ministers. Where Melkor sowed confusion, they enforced dominion. And though their forms varied, some tall as towers, others swifter than ash on the wind, they shared a single essence. They were born of ruin, and they spread it like seed, but they were not merely weapons. In the strange order of Melkor's court, they were trusted, revered even. Among his vast hosts, none were given as much agency, nor as many secrets. They were his inner ring, both tool and symbol, a covenant of dread, forged in loyalty and bound by flame. Their loyalty, however, was not born from fear, nor was it love. It was understanding. The Balrogs did not serve Melkor because he threatened them. They served him because they recognized themselves in him, a reflection of longing unfulfilled, of power unchained by restraint. And in that mirror, their own forms were set alight, their old purposes burned away. They did not lament their change. In fact, they welcomed the clarity. To burn for one will alone is in its own dark way a kind of peace. Even as the world cooled and took form, the Balrogs moved among its cracks. They did not build cities, nor carve altars. Their worship was not of hands, but of flame. Where they gathered, obsidian formed, and from deep within the mountains of shadowed northlands, they watched, waited, not because they feared, but because they understood that the age of fire must arrive in time. They were patient. Theirs was not the haste of mortals, but the stillness of a waiting storm. And yet even within their obedience there flickered a question. To serve a will so great is to risk the erosion of one's own. Among the Balrogs, there remained memory, not only of the music, but of their first light, the time before shadow. It haunted some, drove others deeper into the fire. What was once memory became symbol, a smoldering echo beneath the armor, a heat that could not be quenched. And so they walked not only as flame, but as burdened flame. Terrible, yes, but also marked. Their presence reshaped the moral fabric of Arda, not just in the threat they posed, but in what they represented, the possibility that even the divine could fall, that loyalty and ruin could coexist, and that obedience, when absolute, may burn brighter than rebellion. And so they stood, quiet in their fury, amid the forming world. The fires of their allegiance smoldered in deep vaults and silent slopes. They would not rise yet, not fully. That time would come with war and ruin. But for now, they waited, watching as the firstborn stirred in distant forests and the light of the trees shone far from their gaze. What roles would these lords of flame come to play? How would their obedience, once a quiet thing, shape the greatest tragedies of the First Age? The mountains had not yet settled into their full weight when the first of Melkor's fortresses rose from the bowels of the darkened north. Angband, though not yet called so, was carved with fire and silence into the bones of the earth. There, amid molten rivers and obsidian walls, the Balrogs found a place that matched their nature. Not merely to dwell, but to burn inwardly, to become more than scattered spirits of rebellion. This was not a lair, it was a temple, and through its black corridors, the fire-wrought walked not as beasts, but as wardens of Melkor's rising dominion. They did not build in the way of the elves or dwarves, with craft and vision turned toward beauty. The architecture of the Balrogs was not made to be seen. It was made to be endured. Every vault held breathless heat. Every chamber sang with the memory of pressure and collapse. Walls curved in unnatural geometry, not to welcome but to disorient. Firelight danced in perpetual flicker, never steady, as though mocking the passing of time. These places did not invite conquest. They waited for it to fail. Within these deep chambers, the Balrogs honed the art of stillness. To wait, motionless for centuries, with eyes like coals and thought like lava creeping beneath stone, was not idleness. It was patience, cultivated as a weapon, and in that stillness their minds sharpened. While the lesser creatures of Melkor's horde roared and raged, the Balrogs whispered. Their speech was not loud but absolute, like the crack of stone under strain. They spoke in strategies, in memories of firestorms, in echoes of the music they had once forsaken. Yet even in their halls, the world outside pressed inward. The Valar, wary of Melkor's growing silence, watched the north. From Valinor came no armies yet, but there were murmurings. Even Yavanna, in her gardens, could feel the breath of heat rise unnaturally from the depths. The forests turned their leaves subtly away. The earth trembled in places where it should not. Something old and burning had made its claim beneath the skin of the world. And in Angband, the Balrogs sensed this awareness. They were not cloaked by ignorance. They were protected by dread. Their presence, even unannounced, reshaped the behavior of the world around them. Beasts fled unseen paths. Winds faltered. Snow refused to fall in places where their heat throbbed under stone. Their fortress, though secret to many, was written into the rhythms of Arda like a wrong note sustained across time. It was during this long silence that the Balrogs began to mark territory, not with banners, but with ruin. Blackened hills emerged in lands once fertile. Volcanic chasms split the skin of the earth without clear cause. In regions far from Angband, deep caves echoed with heat, though no sun had ever touched them. These were not accidents. They were symbols, warnings not just to enemies but to time itself. Here lies a will that will not be erased. The first cults of terror began not among mortals. They had not yet awoken, but among the lesser spirits, the twisted mire and fallen creatures who wandered the north. They whispered of the lords of flame, of shapes glimpsed through smoke, of eyes that did not blink. These lesser beings did not understand what the Balrogs were, only that they were not like the rest. Even among Melkor's servants there was hierarchy, and within that order the Balrogs stood apart. Not simply above, but adjacent. They were not commanders of legions. They were laws made flesh, their presence enforced silence. Still, they remained bound. For all their fire and freedom, they moved only when Melkor willed it. His call, whether spoken or merely thought, pulled them as a tide moves ash through a valley. When he dreamed of conquest, they felt heat rise in their limbs. When he brooded in hatred, they smoldered with dormant violence. Yet even so, there were times when they acted without command, when they wandered far into the east, marking places with unseen flame. What they sought, none could say. Perhaps only to see the world they would one day conquer, or perhaps to remember what it meant to walk without purpose. These excursions left marks, though faint. A lake boiled overnight. A mountain grew a scar. A single tree, ancient and lone, turned to stone from root to crown. To scholars of later ages, such phenomena would be mysteries, but they were the footprints of the Balrogs, signatures in terrain, signed not with hand, but with will. And still they returned to Angband, where fire coiled in underground vaults and silence carried weight. They gathered in chambers whose ceilings glowed dimly from heat trapped for centuries. Here they met not to plan, but to wait, for the world was stirring, and in the west the trees had begun to glow. The Valar in their peace had turned inward, but Melkor had not. His fortress stood ready, and his servants, crowned in flame and bound by ancient obedience, had not forgotten the shape of war. Soon the world would awaken, and with it, the need for fire. When the firstborn stirred beneath starlight, the fire that had waited began to shift. Long had the Balrogs slumbered in stillness, their silence more potent than thunder, but now the world breathed with new rhythms. The elves, those luminous children of Ilúvatar, awoke not to conquest but to wonder. And yet, even in those untouched forests and mirror-still lakes of Cuiviénen, a presence loomed that had no place among innocents. It was not yet war, not yet a clash of armies or banners, but the horizon darkened, and in that dimming, the Balrogs moved. Their steps were not loud. The fire that cloaked them did not roar. It shimmered tightly wound, restrained, like lighting caged beneath the skin. They came not as legions but as forerunners, scouts of terror. Their purpose was not yet annihilation, but disruption. To observe the firstborn, to test the reach of fear, to learn the shape of this new music that had entered Arda, and how it might be broken. The elves sensed them, though they did not understand. In the hush between song and speech they felt watched. Dreams curdled into dread. Hunters returned with no memory of where they had walked, only ash upon their garments and the taste of iron in the wind. Fires extinguished themselves, shadows stretched in directions that did not follow the moon. The Balrogs left no message, no mark, and yet their presence wrote itself into the instincts of the children, deep and permanent. What emerged from these first encounters was not understanding, but reflex, a learned stillness. The elves began to whisper of watchers in the hills, of glowing shapes that vanished when pursued. They gave no names, only metaphors, living fire, cloaked ruin, the hollow behind light. And in doing so, they gave the Balrogs power, for even half-formed myths, when repeated under starlight, become real. The Valar, upon discovering the awakening of the elves, acted swiftly to summon them westward. But by then, the damage was done. Melkor's servants had already touched the minds of the firstborn. The Balrogs had not struck them down, but they had struck something deeper, a fracture in trust, a thin crack in the innocence of those who had only just opened their eyes to the world. And when war did come, it would be on ground already prepared by that ancient fear. It was in these shadowed times that the first true clash unfolded. Not a war, but a confrontation of meaning. A group of elves, wandering far from Cuevionen, encountered one who burned and did not burn, who stood as a man but breathed like a forge. There were no words, only the weight of presence. The fire did not leap. It simply existed, brighter than stars, and colder than death. When the elves fled, one among them did not return. No body was found, only scorched stone, and the memory of a scream that never reached the wind. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. The Balrogs moved with intent. Their appearances were chosen, their silences cultivated. They did not slaughter without reason. In truth, they killed very little in those early days, but their purpose was not death. It was imprint, to be remembered, to become part of the shape of fear that would ripple outward into every tale, every caution, every later defiance, a mythology that would bloom long before open war had scorched the fields. And yet, even they were not untouched by those encounters. The Balrogs, shaped by rebellion and obedience, had never known wonder. But in the firstborn, they saw something strange, something untouched by Melkor, something they had once been before fire claimed their forms. The memory was distant, like heat through stone, but it remained. Some turned away after these encounters, vanishing for long stretches into the deep mountains. Others grew more vicious, as though fire could burn memory away. The division did not fracture their obedience, but it colored their flame. Their return to Angband was quiet, marked not by conquest but by thought. Melkor listened, and in their silence he understood. The elves would not be easily broken. Their beauty was not fragile, it was defiant. Their terror was not weakness, it was wisdom forming. And so, Melkor turned his gaze more sharply, drawing the Balrogs closer, binding them more deeply into his next design. For if fear alone would not control the firstborn, then fire must follow. But that day had not yet come. For now the Balrogs remained watchers, not warriors. They moved through the growing dark, flames hooded, fire turned inward. The children of Ilúvatar had seen them, had felt them, and would never again forget the heat that moved without sound. The horizon, once starlit and still, now held promise and foreboding. What had begun as awakening was now shaped by echo. The Balrogs had tested the world, and the world, quietly, had begun to respond. The years that followed were shrouded in a silence thicker than any storm. The firstborn had spread, their songs now echoing across rivers and forests, and Melkor's spies crept beneath that beauty with measured patience. Yet within Angband something deeper was unfolding, a change not of the world but of the beings who served it in fire. The Balrogs, once unflinching in obedience, had begun to feel the weight of their servitude. Power had shaped them, but power also chained them. In the bowels of the fortress, they gathered around the black flames that burned without consuming. No voice spoke command, no hand raised in defiance. It was a stillness heavy with thought, for even among creatures of destruction, the mind does not sleep. They felt the echo of their making, of being turned from the light, of choices made long ago in the void. It was not remorse that stirred in them, but awareness. To serve one will alone is to forget the sound of one's own fire, and in that forgetting, a question smoldered: what is left of the self when all obedience is consumed? Melkor's presence answered, as it always did, not with comfort but with control. When he entered their hall, the air thickened. The black flame trembled, bowing toward his will. His gaze passed over them like a furnace, admiring, testing, possessing. His words were rare, but their meaning absolute. The world is waking, he said, and it must wake to fear. The Balrogs bowed, their armor glowing faintly at the edges. None dared speak, yet the thought of defiance rippled faintly among them like heat escaping a forge. Still, they obeyed. Obedience had become their marrow. The first command was simple: spread the shadow northward. Guard the borders of the sleeping fortress. Let none approach the deep vaults where Melkor gathered his strength. And so they moved once more through the hidden passes and caverns of Middle-earth, their steps low and deliberate. Wherever they passed, stone cracked, air shimmered, and silence followed. Yet not all who served alongside them could bear such presence. The lesser spirits fled their heat, and even the orcs, creatures of Melkor's later design, feared to meet their eyes. It was said among the Dark Legions that to stand too near a Balrog was to feel one's thoughts stripped bare. For their fire was not merely light or heat, it was revelation, the cruel kind that exposes all pretenses. Those who looked into it saw themselves reflected in ruin, and perhaps though none would admit it, the Balrogs saw the same. One among them, whose name has long since turned to ash, began to falter. His flame dimmed, not from weakness but from inward strain. He had fought beside Melkor since the first shaping of Arda, and yet, with each passing age, he burned less brightly. His armor blackened beyond recognition, his voice softened to a hiss. The others saw in him a mirror of their fate, a glimpse of what endless obedience would one day make of them all, and though they did not pity him, they grew wary. Even fire fears extinction. Melkor noticed, of course. He always did, and so he made example of the faltering one. Before the gathered host, he unbound the flame that animated his servant, drawing it upward like smoke into his own hand. The creature's body, once magnificent, collapsed into black glass. Melkor absorbed the flame, his own form brightening briefly before dimming once again. "The fire is mine," he said softly, as though speaking to the world itself. "It returns to me." From that day the Balrogs burned harder, fiercer, but also quieter. What they had witnessed was not punishment but truth. Even their power was not their own. They were extensions of a will that tolerated no division, and so, though no chains bound them, they were bound in essence. Each flicker of defiance within them was smothered beneath the suffocating certainty of Melkor's dominion. And yet the cost of that obedience was not lost. Power exacts its price not only from those who resist it, but from those who wield it without question. The Balrogs began to wither inwardly. They no longer rested between wars, for rest was foreign to fire. Their thoughts became fewer, their emotions refined to purpose alone. What once had been individuality was now reduced to function. And in that function something essential died, a quiet death, unseen but profound. Outside, the world moved toward its first great conflict. The Valar had come forth against Melkor, and the foundations of Arda trembled beneath their clash. Fire met storm, shadow met light. The Balrogs poured from Angband like a tide of burning night, their roars turning the very air to ash. Yet beneath their fury lay not joy, but compulsion. Each blow struck was an echo of Melkor's will, not their own. They fought as extensions of his anger, his despair, his insatiable hunger to dominate creation itself. And though the first battle would end in ruin for their master, the Balrogs endured. For creatures born of fire do not vanish easily. They retreated with him into the deep earth, wounded yet unbroken, smoldering beneath stone as the world above healed. The silence that followed the first battle was deceptive. Beneath the scorched ground and shattered mountains, Melkor brooded in the deep halls of Utumno, and the Balrogs, his most trusted instruments, remained coiled in the quiet like fire beneath ash. The world above, momentarily freed, began to breathe again. But in the dark beneath, the flame did not rest. It refined itself. It was in this long silence that the Balrogs began to organize, not in the crude fashion of armies, but in something older, more elemental. Among them a structure emerged, one not imposed by Melkor, but born of their own nature. It was not rank in the sense of kings and vassals, but a hierarchy of presence. Some burned hotter, their will stronger, their minds deeper. Others deferred, not from fear, but from recognition. The flame that speaks louder is the flame that leads. At the center of this order stood Gothmog. He was not the oldest, nor the largest, but he was the clearest. His fire held shape without tremor. His thoughts moved without smoke. Where others surged with Melkor's rage, Gothmog held that rage, like a sword drawn only when necessary, and always to lethal purpose. He was called the High Captain, though no one had given him that name aloud. It existed simply because it could not be otherwise. Around him gathered a silent circle of the eldest, Balrogs, who remembered the first shaping, who had walked alongside Melkor before Arda was hardened by war. Among them, decisions were made not in speech, but in presence. A shift in heat, a tightening of shadow, a glance like a furnace. These were their signals. Their understanding was ancient, forged in shared memory and tempered in mutual fire. This council did not challenge Melkor's authority. On the contrary, it made his designs stronger. They enforced his silence, protected his hidden movements, and tested the reach of his power, without need for his voice. Where Melkor whispered intention, they enacted it before the echo faded. But beneath that loyalty stirred something more complex, not defiance, but depth, a private world of flame within flame, where purpose could still be shaped, not merely received. In the lower vaults of Utumno, where no light from the surface reached, they etched their history in heat, not carvings, but lines of melted stone and cooled obsidian, charting battles fought, oaths kept, and choices made. These were not records for others. They were reminders to themselves, markers of their long descent from radiant will to bound inferno. Yet even in hierarchy, tension flickered. Some among the younger Balrogs chafed under the slow counsel of the elder fire. They had been born in battle, not memory. Their flame was wild, their obedience sharp but brittle. They whispered of taking more direct roles, of burning faster, of striking sooner. But Gothmog held them back, not with punishment, but with presence. His silence was heavier than threat. His restraint was low. Still, the rift was there, between those who remembered what they once were, and those who knew only what they had become. It was not enough to divide them. but enough to smolder, and in that smoldering, the future stirred. For every hierarchy carries within it the weight of eventual collapse. Melkor allowed the structure to persist. Perhaps he saw its usefulness. Perhaps he saw in Gothmog a reflection of himself, a servant who had learned to shape others without being disloyal. Or perhaps he simply did not fear it. For in his mind, all fire returned to him in the end. All choices were merely tributaries feeding his will. And yet, one must ask, what becomes of beings made of fire when their own decisions are reduced to reflection? Do they forget how to choose? Or does some ember remain quiet, small, but enduring? Above, the stars moved slowly. The Valar, withdrawn to Valinor, fortified their distant realm, shielding it with light. The elves, some having answered the call, others remaining in Middle-earth, lived unaware of the council of flame that watched from beneath the earth. The world seemed for a time untouched, but the watchers still waited. In the north, deep beneath the roots of mountains never named, the Balrogs traced their patterns in molten corridors and silent halls. They practiced their stillness, they refined their fire, and in those long hours where even shadow slept, they did not forget. They remembered the shape of the firstborn's terror. They remembered the feel of the earth beneath their feet during the first battle. They remembered the one among them who had faltered, and the cost of flickering. Gothmog, seated upon a throne not made, but melted from the very wall itself, watched them without movement. His eyes glowed faintly, not with fury, but with purpose so tightly held it did not need to burn bright. He knew what was coming. He could feel the world tilting again, not yet to war, but to resistance. And when resistance came, fire would answer. The hierarchy would hold for now, but the tests ahead would not only pit them against elves or Valar, they would pit them against themselves, against memory, obedience, and the slow erosion of identity beneath endless flame. When the siege lines first began to take shape, it was not with blaring horns or brazen fire. It began, instead, as a quiet suffocation. Paths once open became watched. Hills once still began to smolder from within, and the northern air, always sharp with ice, grew thick with an invisible heat. Morgoth, once Melkor, now master of Utumno, had risen again. And the Balrogs, long patient in silence, were stirred to motion not with frenzy, but with terrifying precision. This was no longer the age of scouts and shadows. The Valar had crossed into Middle-earth with wrath cloaked in radiance. The world trembled under their coming. Yet even before the armies clashed, the Balrogs moved as vanguard and omen, for they were not only weapons now, they were messengers, harbingers of fire made real. Their descent from the high passes into the great northern plains marked the beginning of what would be remembered as the war for the sake of the elves. The Valar came to protect the firstborn, to unmake the fortress of Utumno and break the power that had haunted the night. But before the final strike, the Balrogs came to meet them, not with siege engines or walls, but with flame walking in the shape of will. Where they passed, the land burned unnaturally. Trees turned to black stone, not ash. The ground beneath their feet cracked, not from weight, but from rejection. Arda itself seemed to resist them, as if some memory of its original harmony strained against their presence. But the Balrogs did not care. Resistance was natural. It gave their flame something to press against. At the head of their advance stood Gothmog. No crown adorned his brow, and yet no creature in that field, dark or divine, doubted his authority. His armor glowed with inner fire, not molten, but contained, like anger that had long since learned patience. His great whip of flame arced in his hand, silent for now, but its echo was already written into the wind. The battle that followed was not one of equal footing. The hosts of the Valar came in forms terrible and beautiful, Arame's horn breaking the clouds, Tulkas laughing as he strode into ruin, Varda's light falling like stars. Yet even in that splendor the Balrogs stood, unblinking, not because they expected to win, but because their role was not to win. Their role was to burn, and they did, not aimlessly, not wildly, but with focus. They struck at the flanks, where Mire of lesser stature hesitated. They targeted commanders with memory, not pride. They fell upon watchpoints and shattered lines of song with soundless force. Wherever light tried to concentrate, they moved, not to snuff it out, but to fracture it, to make it flicker. Theirs was not a war of conquest, but of interference, delay, distraction. Each Balrog fought alone, yet never without awareness of the others. Their coordination was not tactical, it was instinctual, a choreography of flame long rehearsed beneath stone. When one faltered, another advanced. When one blazed too brightly, another dimmed. They breathed as one furnace. But they were not impervious. The Valar had not come in half measures, and for every surge of shadow, there came a tide of light. Many Balrogs fell in that war, not extinguished but shattered, their forms torn from coherence, their fire reduced to drifting embers caught in the winds of a world, reclaiming itself. Gothmog did not fall. He held the center, his movements measured, his purpose clear. When Tulkas came crashing through the mountain gate, it was Gothmog who met him, not to defeat, but to delay. Their clash cracked the bones of the earth. No words were spoken, only the sound of impact, flame against strength, echoing across miles. Gothmog did not win, but he did not need to. The fortress held long enough. Autumno was breached, not in a day, but in a storm of days. And when the fortress fell, it was not with the cry of the defeated, but with the silence of something unmade. The Balrogs who survived did not rally. They vanished into fissures, into the roots of mountains, into the memories of fear. They did not wait for orders. They did not mourn their dead. Their dispersal was instinct, a retreat not of defeat, but of preservation. They had burned, and burned well, and now they would smoulder. The world in the aftermath began to reshape itself. The Valar turned west, the elves were gathered, and the scars of the first great war slowly healed into myth. But beneath those myths, buried deep in stone and shadow, the Balrogs waited, fewer now, but no less terrible. They had tasted war, they had tested light, and they had survived both. Long after the ruins of Autumno had collapsed into myth, and the Valar turned their gaze westward to Valinor's shining shores, darkness began to gather once more in the farthest reaches of Middle-earth. A new fortress was being shaped, this time not in haste, but with cruel precision. Angband, the Iron Prison, born not of secrecy but defiance, and within its walls the Balrogs gathered again, fewer than before, but refined by silence and war. They did not speak of Autumno. They did not mourn its fall. Fire does not look backward. It consumes what lies ahead. And so they turned their attention to a new rising threat, one that would come not from the heavens, but from among the children of Ilúvatar themselves, elves who had seen the light of the trees. Elves who had crossed into exile with fury in their hearts and swords in their hands. The Balrogs had been waiting, not in slumber, but in study. For centuries they had traced the stirrings of these exiled elves, watching them cross ice and fire to return to the lands of their birth. These were not the same firstborn they had once stalked beneath the stars. These elves came clothed in craft and vengeance, bearing names that would become legend: Fëanor, Fingolfin, Maedhros. Their war was not one of survival, it was a reckoning. The siege of Angband began as a wall of flame held back by spears of ice. The Noldor were not afraid, not yet. They built fortresses across the northern frontier. They carved watchtowers, named rivers, lit fires on distant peaks. For a time, they believed they had caged Morgoth, but fire does not stay caged forever. Deep in the roots of Thangorodrim, the Balrogs stirred once more, waiting not for orders, but for purpose. That purpose came in smoke and steel during the Daigor Nuin Gileath, the battle under stars. It was here that fire and oath first collided. Fëanor, proud and terrible, drove deep into the north, his wrath brighter than any torch. He came close, too close, and the Balrogs met him in kind, not as an ambush but as a summons. They poured from the gates like a storm made solid, flame-wrapped bodies cracking the earth beneath their feet. And at their head, Gothmog came once more, his whip singing through air. Fëanor did not retreat. That was not his way. He stood against them alone, his sons scattered, his army distant. The fire in his soul met the fire in theirs, and the valley became a furnace. They encircled him, not in haste, but in ritual. Each strike was part of an unspoken pattern. Punishment, prophecy, payment, for the Silmarils he had claimed, for the blood he had spilled, for the words he had carved into fate. Fëanor fell, not quickly, and not in fear. He fell as one whose fire had burned too brightly for too long, and when he was gone, the Balrogs did not cheer. They did not speak. They withdrew into shadow, leaving the ruin behind them like ash from a pyre. The elves would remember it as slaughter, but the Balrogs remembered it as correction. Gondolin came later, and it came hidden. A city not of conquest but of sanctuary, built in secret by Turgon, shielded by mountains and silence. It stood untouched for hundreds of years. But silence, like all things, cracks. And Angband is patient. Morgoth's spies found paths through stone. His servants traced shadows that led deeper than memory. And when the time came, the Balrogs marched not in haste, but in certainty. They descended upon Gondolin not as conquerors, but as executioners. Their fire swept through halls of marble and silver. Towers fell, fountains turned to steam. The city that had once defied the shadow burned from within. Maegalin's betrayal opened the gate, but it was Gothmog's hand that closed it. There, in the heart of Gondolin, the High Captain met Ecthelion of the Fountain, not in ranks, but alone. The clash was silent but for the hiss of water and fire. Steel met flame, marble cracked beneath their struggle. It was not a duel of victory, but of end. Ecthelion struck deep, driving his blade and his body into the heart of the fire. Gothmog, ancient and mighty, fell into the fountains he had come to desecrate. He did not rise again. And still Gondolin died. The Balrogs did not leave a banner, did not linger to claim spoils. They departed like smoke after a blaze, silent, consuming, gone, fewer than before. Dimmer than before, but not extinguished. The world changed after Gondolin. The elves no longer believed fire could be contained. The Valar stirred in the west. The war of wrath drew near, and the Balrogs, scattered now, faded into deep and hollow places, beneath mountains, within forgotten cracks of the world. Some say they sleep, others say they watch. In the years that followed the fall of Gondolin, fire receded from memory. The great wars of the First Age had drawn to their grim crescendo, and the weight of the world seemed poised for a final reckoning. Morgoth remained bound within Angband, but his strength was waning. The Valar prepared for war once more, and the hosts of the West stirred in slow thunder. Yet, as the world turned its gaze toward the looming cataclysm, a different battle unfolded, not on the plains, but in the minds of those who remembered. The Balrogs had vanished from the open world. Their forms no longer blazed across battlefields, nor did their whips of flame lash through the towers of kings. Instead, they had passed into legend, half remembered, half invented. And in that half-light they became something more than creatures. They became fear itself. Among elves and men the tales varied. Some spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed in ruined places, eyes like coals watching from collapsed vaults, breaths like furnace wind in the deepest caves. Others told of wandering fires on the horizon, silent and slow, that vanished when pursued. No proof was ever found, but none who told the stories doubted their truth, for the Balrogs, even in absence, left behind an echo that could not be silenced. These legends became a shield and a warning. Children were told to avoid the old ruins, the deep paths under the mountains, the cracks in the world where warmth turned stifling and silence grew heavy. Warriors carved runes of protection on their blades, though few could say from what. Scribes copied stories onto brittle parchment, each one subtly reshaping the Balrogs into something less precise, more archetypal: demon, beast, fallen god. The boundaries blurred, the reality faded, and yet the fear endured. It is in this space, between history and horror, that the legacy of the Balrogs truly bloomed. For even as their numbers dwindled, their presence expanded. They had become myth, yes, but not merely decoration. Their memory was woven into strategy, into lore, into the instincts of those who had never seen them and never would. Entire fortresses were built to defend against threats no longer visible. Armies trained to fight flame-wreathed phantoms rather than real enemies. In trying to forget them, the world had made them ever-present. Among the dwarves, too, the memory lingered. Their deep halls, though proud and strong, bore within them a quiet reverence for the old fire. It is said that in the deepest delvings of their kind, where even echo begins to hesitate, songs were sometimes heard, low and rhythmless, like breathing in stone. The dwarves spoke little of such things, but the oldest among them carried torches into places no torch should be needed, and they walked with the careful silence of those who knew they were never truly alone. Even the orcs, twisted, broken, reshaped by Morgoth's hand, told stories in hushed growls. They feared their former masters more than their enemies. To them, the Balrogs were not saviors or champions, but overseers, reminders of pain layered into fire. They remembered the heat that did not warm, the voice that seared without sound. In their crude rituals, they sometimes painted flames on their foreheads to ward away the unseen watchers beneath the stone. For they believed the Balrogs still listened, and perhaps they did. But the greatest mark of the Balrogs' enduring power lay not in the fears of orcs or the tales of elves, but in the silence of the Valar. For all their might, all their wisdom, the Valar never spoke openly of the Balrogs after the fall. They had no numbers to count, no census of fire. Morgoth's hosts had been vast, and in the chaos of the War of Wrath, many creatures had fled, scattered across a world reshaped by ruin. The Balrogs, if any remained, had found cracks deep enough to swallow time, and so a quiet consensus formed. They were gone, or nearly gone. Perhaps 3, perhaps fewer, perhaps only 1. But 1 was enough. 1 was always enough. In this space of maybe, the Balrogs gained their final and most dangerous weapon: uncertainty. A threat that may come at any moment is more powerful than one that certainly will. A fire that might be waiting in the dark is harder to dismiss than one already seen and extinguished. And so, as the Second Age dawned, and great kingdoms rose and fell in the shadow of new powers, the Balrogs remained. Now as memory, now as myth, now as whispered warning. No longer generals of war, they had become something deeper, something older. They were the fear that shapes choices, the dread that lingers long after the fire dies. In the slow turning of the Second Age, the fire that once walked in daylight had withdrawn beneath the world. The Balrogs no longer stormed cities or carved their names into stone. Their presence had become spectral, an echo stretched across centuries, blurred at the edges by retellings and softened by the arrogance of forgetfulness. But fire, even smothered, does not die. It hides. It learns to burn quietly. Somewhere beneath the foundations of Middle-earth, in caverns older than memory, they endured. Whether one or many, it did not matter. The world above had changed, but below, the ancient fires still pulsed. What little remained of the Balrogs adapted to a different form of warfare, one not fought with legions, but with time. No longer guardians of fortresses, they became guardians of silence, of the deep spaces the world had forgotten how to name. But the world, driven by curiosity and hunger, eventually trespasses. The dwarves, masters of stone and delving, expanded their kingdoms ever downward, driven by craft and pride. They built halls with pillars, like forests, bridges over chasms too deep to measure, and forges whose heat rivaled the sun. Beneath the roots of the misty mountains, in the proud kingdom of Khazad-dûm, they dug not for war, but for wonder. It was wonder that led them to Mithril, and it was Mithril that led them too far. For years they tunneled, deeper than wisdom would permit. They followed the silver veins like veins of fate, ignoring the strange warmth that rose from the stone, the dreams that grew troubled, the hollow silence between hammer strikes. They told themselves they were alone. They were not. In the lowest depths where even echo hesitated, they found something older than stone, a heat that did not flicker, a breath that had waited, and then awakening. It is said that the mountains screamed, that the halls shook not from collapse but from something rising, not with rage, but with inevitability. The Balrog, if it was the last, rose not like a beast startled from sleep, but like a memory reasserting itself. To the dwarves, it came as terror, but to the fire, it was merely continuation. It did not speak, it did not negotiate, it moved. The forges of Khazad-dûm were quenched in a single breath. The great halls, once filled with music and laughter, became tunnels of ash. The dwarves fled, their footsteps swallowed by the mountain, and behind them the fire walked, deliberate and unhurried. They called it Durin's Bane, a name forged, not in defiance, but in mourning, for the king who had built the greatest hall beneath the world had fallen, and his line had lost its heart. The Balrog did not pursue the survivors. It did not seek conquest. Instead, it claimed the depths as its own, returning to silence as naturally as it had emerged from it. In that stillness, it waited, not for orders, not for war, but simply because it had become what it always was, fire with memory. Above, the world changed. Elves dwindled, men rose, the kingdoms of the west fell and rose again. But Khazad-dûm, now called Moria, remained sealed, not by stone, but by fear. Travelers passed wide around the mountain. Stories grew, and as before, those stories gave the Balrog a second life, one made of shadow and suggestion. When the Fellowship of the Ring came at last, long after the world had forgotten how to fear the ancient names, they found more than ruin. They found the shape of memory waiting, coiled in fire. The battle that followed was not merely a clash of bodies, but of legacies. Gandalf, bearer of flame uncorrupted, met the Balrog not as prey, but as equal, fire against fire. And in that meeting, the last known Balrog rose into light once more. Their battle climbed from the depths to the peaks of the world, and there, above the snows, it ended. The Balrog fell. But even in falling, it burned. It left no corpse, no tomb, only smoke and silence, and the knowledge that such fire had once walked the world again. Its end did not erase its kind, for whether others yet wait in deeper places, or whether that fire has passed into the bones of the earth, none can say. What remains is not certainty, but the echo, the knowledge that fire, once awakened, may always return. Long after the flames of the last known Balrog fell into shadow on the peak of Xeraxigil, the echo of its passage continued to ripple outward. Mountains forgot, stone healed, and the world pressed forward into its third age. Yet beneath the movement of kings and the weaving of new legends, a quieter truth endured. Fear, once kindled, never fully dies. Even among the wise, there remained a tension, a subtle resistance to speaking of the Balrogs as truly gone. Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf before his return, none claimed certainty. The great defeat in the deeps had removed a threat, yes, but had it ended the story? The silence that followed was not the silence of closure, but of caution, for the deepest places in the world had never been mapped, and the wounds of the earth often healed over fire that still smoldered beneath. It was in these folds of uncertainty that a new kind of presence emerged, one not of roaring flame, but of influence. Travelers spoke of dreams that burned without heat, of old tunnels where iron tools warped in their holders, of chambers that whispered not with sound, but with temperature. The Balrogs, it seemed, had left behind something more insidious than smoke, a logic of fire, a rhythm of dread carved into the deep veins of Arda. In hidden strongholds and aging libraries, the stewards of lore traced patterns in these stories. A dwarven scribe in the Blue Mountains recorded tremors beneath ancient quarries. An elven wanderer found blackened footprints etched into rock too hard for ordinary flame. A ranger of the north, returning from the wild, spoke of a hollow in the hills where birds did not sing and water would not settle. No one declared the return of the Balrogs, but none could dismiss the thread connecting such tales. It was no longer a question of if the fire remained, it was a question of what form it had taken. For a being like a Balrog, forged in the earliest rebellion, shaped by will and bound to shadow, does not vanish like a flame doused by wind. It disperses, it withdraws, it alters its rhythm. Some speculated that the Balrog of Moria had not been a survivor of the War of Wrath, but a sleeper, an ember that had waited for the mountain to crack open once more. If that was true, then what of the others? Could fire, when it forgets itself, become something stranger still? In the whispered debates of scholars, a new idea took root, not of remaining Balrogs, but of changed Balrogs, beings that no longer walked in flame and whip, but in absence, in wait, in the subtle unraveling of courage. Perhaps the true cost of Morgoth's corruption was not the army of fire he left behind, but the enduring pattern he etched into the world, the memory of domination, smoldering in places no light could reach. Some began to refer to these presences as echoes, though they were more than that, not ghosts, not impressions, but consequences, a residue of consciousness that could not be unmade by time or war. In the ruins of Angband, buried beneath leagues of broken stone, such forces may still coil like smoke behind glass, and if stirred, what form would they take? Would they burn as before, or would they manifest in subtler ways, folding into the decisions of kings, the faltering of heroes, the trembling just before a sword is drawn? In this space, the Balrogs evolved beyond creature. They became archetype, the moment before collapse, the temptation of unchecked force, the voice that whispers, "Burn it all." And perhaps that is their truest legacy. Not the battles they fought, nor the towers they burned, but the permission they represent, the proof that even divine fire can fall, that loyalty can become ruin, that power, once severed from its origin, can persist in dreadful independence. Thus, the world lives in uneasy balance. Not because the Balrogs are seen, but because they might be. Not because they rule, but because their rule was never truly broken, only buried. And even now, in ages of diminished wonder, when the great evils have names and faces, it is the nameless heat that causes the deepest hesitation. In the end, the Balrog was never merely a creature of Morgoth. It was a creature of decision, of dissent, of the moment when will turns from song to scream. And as long as such moments remain possible in the hearts of elves, men or dwarves, the Balrog walks still, if not in flame, then in consequence. So when the wind shifts strangely in an empty tunnel, or the ground beneath a city pulses once without cause, or a hero hesitates at the edge of battle, wondering what waits in the dark, know that the fire has not forgotten. It never does. There are places in Middle-earth where the silence feels heavier, as though the earth itself remembers what it has buried. Deep valleys where the fog never lifts. Ravines where even birds do not fly. Caves whose mouths are not empty, but sealed as if the world has closed its lips against something it once spoke too loudly. These are not marks left by fire, but by the absence that follows it. Not ruin, but remembrance. After the death of the Balrog in Moria, the world believed itself cleansed of ancient flame. The tale spread far and wide, spoken with awe, with relief, with finality. The last of them had fallen, it was said. Fire had met its end. And yet, in the quiet retellings, there was always an edge, something unsaid, a lingering hesitation at the end of the story. Because fire does not always end with ash. Sometimes it ends with breath held too long. What remained was not a creature, it was a pattern, a silence, shaped like a shadow. A whisper that returned in the moments between footsteps in deep places. In Angband their names had once burned with pride. Now they moved only in memory. But memory, when carried long enough, becomes geography. The Balrogs had imprinted themselves into the terrain of fear. The people of Middle-earth, though scattered and diverse, shared a quiet agreement. There were depths they would not test, ruins they would not map. And when they spoke of those places, their words grew soft, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention from something listening still. Yet what was that presence, if not a being? Perhaps it was the breath of a forgotten fire, not sentient but instinctual. Perhaps it was something more, a consciousness diffused, no longer bound to form, yet still aware. It did not rise in flames, did not swing a whip, but it curled in the architecture of thought. It shaped dreams. It breathed caution into courage. The great cities above, Minas Tirith, Rivendell, Edoras, had grown used to sunlight and the passing of time. But time does not erase what is buried. It only deepens the soil. Beneath the proud banners and marble halls, the foundations remembered. Every tremor that passed beneath the stone carried with it the smallest echo of heat. And there were those who heard it. The deep listeners, the miners who paused in mid-strike, the wandering wizards who tilted their heads at still air, the lore masters who frowned at sudden warmth in the margins of ancient parchment. They could not name what they felt, but they recorded it carefully, respectfully. Some of these observations became riddles, others became warnings, and a few, quietly, became rituals. In certain corners of Middle-earth, fires are never lit underground without speaking aloud, not to banish fear, but to acknowledge it, to give it form, so it does not come uninvited. The wise understand that fear, like fire, must be tended. Left alone it grows wild. Thus, the Balrog, long dead, became not a threat but a presence. It lived in choice, in the hesitation before entering a dark tunnel, in the double-checking of doors before nightfall. It was no longer a beast to be fought, but a threshold to be respected. Even among the elves who had seen light and shadow in full, the idea endured. In Lothlorien, Galadriel once walked the golden paths with her thoughts far away, not to Valinor, but to a black chasm beneath a distant mountain. She had not seen the Balrog in Moria, but she had felt it stir long before the Fellowship crossed her woods. She had tasted the shape of its presence. Fire can be seen, but its weight can also be felt across leagues, like a ripple across the surface of fate. And so it was that the Balrog, though defeated in form, remained undefeated in influence, not because it acted, but because the world acted around its absence. In avoiding its return, the peoples of Middle-earth shaped their cities, their stories, their silences. It is tempting to call this fear, but perhaps it is something else, reverence, an understanding that there are truths too large to be slain with a sword, too old to be locked behind stone. The Balrog was not merely a monster. It was a memory of what happens when flame forgets its purpose. And perhaps that is the lesson the world chose to keep. That fire must not be shamed, only guided. That will must not be erased, only tempered. And that silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is the place where consequence rests. In the end, the last flame did not die. It simply stepped back, leaving space for the world to ask itself what it had learned. In the cold hush that followed ages of fire, the world turned slowly toward the light, but the deep places remained untouched, not only by war, but by time. Beneath the roots of mountains and the bones of forgotten realms, the remnants of the First Age slumbered, not as beasts, but as atmospheres. It was in these hollow depths that the memory of the Balrogs settled most densely, not in form, but in feeling. There is a difference between absence and silence. One is the vanishing of a thing, the other is the waiting of it. And in the darkest corridors of Middle-earth, it was the second that endured. The Balrogs, whether extinguished in body or dispersed into deeper laws of nature, had left behind a tension that did not dissipate. It condensed. In dwarven lore, there exists a word not easily translated, a term for the kind of fear that doesn't leap, but crouches, that doesn't strike, but leans ever closer. It was used sparingly, and never in jest. The dwarves of the later ages, even those who returned to Moria in bold reclamation, whispered it when the air turned still. They knew what their ancestors had fled. They knew what might still wait behind walls older than reckoning. And it was not only in stone that this tension remained. The elves, long-lived and wise, carried the memory differently. They did not speak of the Balrogs in their songs. Their stories were of light, of courage, of mourning. Yet between those threads there was always a void, a space shaped like fire, left unspoken not because it was forgotten, but because it was still listening. Among men, the memory was more fragile, more fluid. In time, the Balrogs became legend, and then something more diffuse, transformed into the language of monsters and devils, metaphors for wrath and judgment. But the core remained, in every campfire tale of dark things in the deep. In every fearful glance toward the roots of mountains, the shape of the Balrog still lingered. And though no new sightings were recorded, the world continued to build around the possibility. Armies still forged weapons capable of withstanding unnatural heat. Architects still designed strongholds with narrow choke points and vaulted ceilings, defenses against foes whose wings were not for flight, but for fear. The architecture of Middle-earth had memory, and that memory was shaped by fire. In this quiet age, a scholar of Gondor named Malian began collecting fragments, notes from explorers, songs from remote villages, half-erased inscriptions on cave walls. He was not a warrior, nor did he claim prophetic wisdom, but he believed, stubbornly and patiently, that the fire had never left, that the Balrogs, if truly gone, had not faded from the world, but into it. His writings were cautious, almost reverent. He did not name places directly, nor did he speculate on how many might remain. What he sought was not proof, but pattern. He catalogued sudden heat blooms in the deepest mines. He noted stories of glowing eyes in mountain storms. He studied how certain metals warped when brought near seemingly ordinary rock, and in these small, unconnected things, he felt the outline of something vast. Melian died quietly in his study, his last entry unfinished, but his scrolls survived, passed hand to hand, misfiled, lost, recovered. And those who read them, those who understood what they truly described, did not dismiss them. They folded them carefully. They stored them in vaults beneath libraries. They did not speak of them, because even now, the world remains unfinished. Mountains shift, earthquakes, and in the long silence between such movements, something listens, something remembers. The Balrog may never walk again in the way it once did, may never roar through shattered cities or clash with mire upon mountain tops, but its echo is not bound to form. It is bound to flame, and flame, as the wise know, takes many shapes. Perhaps that is the final truth of the Balrogs, that they were never only creatures of heat and shadow, but of will, will twisted, will unbound, will set loose into the world and given form by rebellion. Such things do not die. They evolve, they return, they settle where the world is weakest, where memory is deepest, and where silence is mistaken for peace. And so, the story of the Balrogs does not end in the fall of towers or the quieting of fire. It ends in the minds of those who remember that fire can return, that in every flickering torch, in every deep breath taken before entering darkness, there is a question not yet answered. If there is a final truth to the story of the Balrogs, it is not found in their fall, but in what they left behind. Not in the shape of their bodies, nor the glow of their fire, but in the long arc of consequence that followed wherever they passed. In their rise and ruin they revealed a pattern that the world was slow to understand, a lesson not about destruction, but about the nature of power unbound. The Balrogs were born of grandeur and descent. They were not made in mockery, like orcs, nor crafted in secrecy, like dragons. They were once beings of light, mire of the same essence as the Istari, of the same origin as the powers who shaped the stars. Their fall was not a collapse, but a transformation, a willing surrender of self to fire, to wrath, to obedience. And in that surrender, they became more than corrupted. They became fixed, singular, instruments of a will, not their own. They did not question, because they had already chosen not to. And perhaps this, more than their fire, was what made them terrible. They became the embodiment of what it means to give oneself completely to power, without pause, to become flame without boundary, to serve a master whose will grew darker than the void. In this way, the Balrogs outlived their purpose. For Morgoth's downfall was not their end. Even as his spirit was cast beyond the circles of the world, the Balrogs remained burning, waiting, buried. Their fire was not extinguished with his defeat. It had become something older than loyalty. It had become legacy. And what is legacy, if not the echo of a mistake made too large to contain? In the deep heart of the earth, where time slows and stone listens, the memory of the Balrogs lingers, not as a warning alone, but as a question. What happens when will and power are severed from wisdom? When strength is praised more than restraint? The Balrogs show us that even those born of beauty can choose a path. So narrow it becomes a blade, that even fire, meant to warm, can forget how not to consume. In their wake, empires learn to fear heat. Kings built their strongholds in cool places, beneath banners that shimmered like water. Great halls were designed not only for defense, but to breathe, to resist the creeping dread that comes when the air thickens and the shadows begin to glow. The architecture of safety was, in part, an answer to the memory of the Balrogs. And yet, they were never mindless. This must be remembered. For even Gothmog, High Captain of the Balrogs, moved with intent, not instinct. His flame had precision. His silence was chosen. What thoughts burned beneath that helm of fire? What remnants of memory he carried from the music of the Ainur? These remain beyond knowing. But it is certain he remembered what he had once been. And in that remembrance there is tragedy, because the Balrogs are not only figures of fear, they are figures of loss. Not the kind measured in lives or cities, but the deeper loss, the loss of possibility. Each one was a voice once meant to sing, a mind meant to shape beauty, a spirit capable of kindness, of wonder, of insight. All of that was given over, melted down, reforged into obedience, into fire without direction, but down. The ruin they brought to Middle-earth is well recorded. Gondolin burned, Dwarodel fell, entire bloodlines scattered like ash. But perhaps the greater ruin is what they might have built, had they not turned, the wisdom they could have shared, the harmony they might have preserved. These are losses that no war can measure. And so the Balrog endures, not only in fear, but in the aching absence of what might have been. They are reminders not only of fire's hunger, but of how far a spirit can fall when it forgets its origin, when it chooses domination over creation. In this light, their defeat by elf, by dwarf, by wizard is not triumph alone. It is elegy. The slaying of a Balrog is not the ending of a monster. It is the severing of a thread that once stretched back to the dawn of all things. And that severing, though necessary, carries sorrow. For this is the great paradox of the Balrogs. They were born of the same light they sought to burn. They were not foreign. They were family, fallen, and when fire fights fire, there can be no clean victory. Only survival and silence, and the long work of memory. Perhaps this is why, even now, long after their forms have passed into myth, the world does not speak of them lightly. Why their names, if remembered at all, are spoken only in shadow. Because deep down, every heart that knows the story understands. The fire had faded, the shadow withdrawn, and still the story lingered, not in smoke or ruin, but in the spaces between words, in the weight behind silence. The tale of the Balrogs had reached its end, not with finality, but with understanding. And in that quiet realization, a deeper truth emerged, that not all endings are extinguishments. Some are dispersals, some are echoes, some are the soft return of a world, learning how to live again after the fire has passed through it. In the Fourth Age and beyond, the name Balrog ceased to be spoken with the sharpness it once carried. Among the younger races, it became a curiosity, an ancient threat displaced by more present concerns, failing crops, rising lords, shifting alliances. But in hidden corners, where age still mattered, the memory remained intact. The elves did not forget. The dwarves, though they no longer mined beneath Khazad-dûm, still left offerings at the mouths of certain caves, and in Gondor's deepest archives, guarded behind stone and oath, the old scrolls remained sealed, not because they were dangerous to read, but because they were dangerous to forget. For though the Balrogs had ceased to walk the world, their lesson had not. To remember the Balrogs is to remember what it means to fall inward. Their story is not one of foreign evil brought into the world, but of native greatness turned against itself. They were not born to destroy. They were born with the same light as all the Maya. They chose flame not as rebellion but as devotion, a loyalty so complete it erased identity. In that choice they became ruin, not only of others but of themselves. And so the last chapter of their story is not a battle. It is not a scream of flame or a crumbling tower. It is a reflection, a long, slow reckoning with the cost of becoming the weapon of another's will. What survives of the Balrogs now lives in myth and in metaphor. They are invoked in cautionary tales, in the uneasy comparisons drawn when ambition grows too hot, when loyalty demands too much. They appear in dreams not as monsters, but as questions. What would you give to serve a power you do not fully understand? What remains of you when the fire you carry no longer needs you? There are places still rare, remote, where the air shivers for no reason, and the stone beneath your feet feels too warm. Places where sound does not echo, and where sleep comes slowly, burdened by unplaceable weight. In those places it is not the Balrog who waits, but the memory of what it meant. For in the end, that is what legacy becomes. Not the thing itself, but the shape it carves into the world around it. And the Balrogs, though long gone, carved deep, their memory is not fire. It is the silence left when fire has passed. It is the hesitation before the torch is lit, the careful glance before the path is chosen. Even in triumph, the world remembers the price of flame. The ruins of Gondolin still stand beneath the rock. The blackened scars of Moria have not faded. And though Morgoth was cast beyond the circles of the world, the instruments of his will left marks that time alone cannot erase. In this way, the Balrog became more than myth. It became a warning, a figure not of terror alone, but of sorrow, the kind of sorrow reserved for those who could have been great, who once were, and who were lost not by death, but by choice. That is why their story is not told with hatred, but with a kind of reverent distance, a sadness wrapped in flame. And if, one day, fire walks again, if a shape of shadow and wrath emerges from the deep and shakes the stone with its step, it will not be unexpected. The world has always known that certain choices leave echoes too loud to fade entirely. The Balrog does not need to return to be present. Its memory is enough. And so the world turns onward, into ages unknown, watched by stars that have seen all things, and remember more than they speak. The wind moves through forgotten halls. The deep places wait undisturbed. The flame sleeps. But sleep is not death.